Welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast, a podcast from the home of Scrum. In this podcast, we feature professional Scrum trainers and other Scrum practitioners sharing their stories and experiences to help learn from the experience of others. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org. Today's podcast, it's one of my favorite topics, actually. It's about customer success or customer case studies. We're going to actually hear about a real life use of professional Scrum and agility in the real, as it were, in the wild. So I'm excited to have Steve Lizotte and Yuval Yeret from to talk to us today. Steve's VP of Engineering for Advanced Recognition Systems of NEC America. So for the people that have been in trouble with the law, you've probably used his system, but we're not going to talk about that, so don't worry about it. And obviously, some of you may have heard Yuval on this podcast before. Yuval is one of our amazing professional Scrum trainers based in Boston, Massachusetts. So welcome to the podcast, gentlemen.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be here again.
Awesome. So we've got lots to talk about. Can we start though? Steve, tell us a little bit about what Advanced Recognition Systems does at NEC.
So what we do is we develop product and services that are used primarily by state and local law enforcement agencies, and it's used for two purposes. The primary purpose is in the pursuit of criminal investigations. So lifting fingerprints from a crime scene, for instance, ingesting them into the system and trying to see if there's a match somewhere. If the law enforcement agency has identified a potential suspect. And that goes, state and local all the way out through federal agencies like the FBI. That same basic technology is also used for enrollment and background checks. So if you've ever had to be fingerprinted as part of a new employment offer, you have to pass a background check, go get fingerprinted. We process that type of case as well.
That's awesome. So actually, yeah, when I became a citizen for this amazing country a few years ago, I had to do fingerprints. So I'm sure your system was involved in that. Well, thank you. Thank you for not finding that I was a match with some crazy person somewhere else. So I really do appreciate that. Okay, so from what you're saying, Steve, advanced recognition at NEC has been around for quite some time, right?
Sure, Dave. NEC of America actually was incorporated only in 2006, but the backstory is really interesting, and it goes much further back. And so the origin actually starts in the 1960s. When computing was just in its infancy. And one of the core problems that people in this area had was, how do we automate the process of matching fingerprints? Up until then, it had been literally a manual process, right? So you're picking up, one and looking at the other and trying to manually determine whether or not there's a match or not. And so in the 60s, there were a number of efforts that were initiated to start automating this using computers. One of those initiatives was by NEC. Also around the same time, there were a couple of RFIs that were released. One of them was from the FBI in the US, but another one was in Japan, and that was from the National Police Agency of Japan. NEC obviously gravitated towards that one and worked about 10 years with that agency to develop an automated system. And they actually deployed the system there in 1982. That was the first large-scale deployment of an AFIS system by NEC. Once that was deployed, they started marketing it to the US. And in the US, they were able to latch on and secure a deal with the city of San Francisco. And so the first US-based deployment by NEC was in San Francisco, a city-size system. That followed very shortly afterwards with the first statewide system in California. And I think that is now California Department of Justice. Now, the interesting thing about that one is that it was instrumental in solving the Night Stalker case in Los Angeles in 1985. So a fingerprint was lifted from a crime scene. It was matched to this suspect who had a previous record, and it ended up being the Night Stalker, who was Richard Ramirez. And so he was arrested within days because the agency was able to identify him and then send his photograph out, alert the public that we're looking for this guy. We think he might be the Night Stalker. And lo and behold, they caught him really quickly. So that's the backstory, kind of long. It goes way back, but that's the origins of how NEC got into the law enforcement business and started being one of the pioneers with this technology. Another interesting anecdote just about matching and being in the law enforcement business is that we do upgrades all the time, right? We're constantly working on whatever, up to a dozen upgrades of systems, either new deployments or upgrades to existing customers. And with those upgrades comes improvements in the algorithms, right? That original algorithm back in the 1960s has been evolved like every 6 months. They come out with new and better ways and faster ways of matching. And so when we complete an upgrade for a customer, they rerun all of the cold cases. And invariably, they will find matches that weren't previously able to be matched. And so it's so cool and rewarding as an organization to hear from these law enforcement agencies when they get a match or get a hit on a cold case. And so it's part of the reason why we do this, right? It's part of our core being and motivation for why we do this is to, help improve the safety of law enforcement and the general citizenry. So it's pretty cool stuff.
So very successful business, keeping this country secure, and catching bad guys and girls. So why would you need to do Agile and Scrum? Tell me a little bit about the problem that brought you to working with Yuval.
Yeah, the initial problem really with the business had been very successful. Even going back to the pre-COVID period, which wasn't that long ago, it was a very, very successful business, generating a lot of OP. And then COVID hit, and for whatever reasons, the organization started doing things maybe a little bit differently and just ran into some execution problems. And so I had known Yuval from my past experience at another company. We started working, I think, in 2018, maybe 2019, in a very similar environment. And so when I got to NEC of America, I was really hired in part to bring in a lean, agile culture and to break some of the silos that existed within the teams and to provide some structure. And so I reached out to Yuval pretty quickly. I started in May of 2022, and I think I reached out to him that summer. We started internally splitting the teams up, between product and program. Everybody previously had been all part of the same pod. So we separated product development from program delivery, and we created Scrum teams on both sides. And we probably ran through, 3 or 4 sprint cycles before we reached out to Yuval and started putting together formal training. And the reason for that was I wanted to have experiences with the teams failing, right? I wanted them to have some experience trying to use things, getting familiar with the vernacular and the overall process, so that when Yuval came in with more formal training, we would have some problems that we could throw at him, right? We tried to do this and it's failing, or this is the way I'm doing it. Am I doing it properly? Versus just going cold turkey, having somebody come in saying, this is Scrum, here's how you should do it. And then we go off and start after the fact. And it's been very successful. I mean, Yuval was a great trainer, especially in that context, dealing with real world problems.
Okay, so I'll get to you, Yuval, in a minute. I just need to lean into this a little bit.
Sure.
So that's a really interesting and a really good pattern, actually, trying something and actually getting some experience of it and then doing training. It's a little different to perhaps what most customers do, which is, it's great to hear that, this experiential sort of driven approach, because then ultimately you can come to a training with lots of real experience, which may be good, may be bad, but it's very useful. So Yuval, you came in, started helping NEC. What was your observations when you arrived?
Steve kind of talked through the separation of product and program. Maybe to elaborate on that a bit. this is the sort of organization which straddles this divide between we need to build our product and continue to build the product, but also each agency that wants to use our product, it's not as easy as you take it off the shelf and it just works. You need to integrate it into their systems. You need to maybe customize it to the local laws. So there's a lot of delivery work that these teams are doing. And one of the things that we were seeing was both, going to the Scrum value of focus. As Steve mentioned, teams were struggling with focus. They were struggling with focus both from the perspective of how do we juggle, and they were really juggling the work on building the future of the product, as well as working on multiple programs of implementing the product for multiple agencies. The business was so successful that there were a lot of programs in flight, right? That's the sort of business that cannot or does not say no, does not know how to say no to, California coming and asking for, for a system, or Tennessee asking for a system. And I don't know if those are the real states just coming up with something. I don't want to even talk about the real states and organizations that use this, but that's something that we were seeing. And we started applying focus at multiple levels. One was, like Steve said, defining teams that focus on products versus teams that focus on programs, and then trying to create teams that can own a product, but also limit the amount of programs that a team was focused on, all the way to, using Scrum and sprint planning to make sure that the teams don't take more than they can, which is a real struggle when they have project managers, program managers, business people, all wielding milestones and dates that the teams weren't part of figuring out. That's a classic pattern that, Steve and I were dealing with in that previous organization as well. So we had some battle scars from that those types of experiences. You mentioned the real world. This is Agile in the real world. People that come in and say, we'll just pull whatever makes sense into the sprint plan and ignore everything else out there, no roadmaps, etc. That doesn't work. I mean, you could build an organization around that, but you need a very different business model, business people, and conversations around that. And you need to understand that that's not necessarily the reality that you're in, and you need to figure out how to use the Agile principles in that environment. And that's what we set out doing, using some combination of the Scrum values, principles, practices, as well as some elements of Kanban and flow to help the teams both improve how they're doing, as well as gain an insight on where are the constraints, what's going on.
So I do want to, you talked about the separation of program teams from product teams. So obviously I know nothing about the situation, but that instantly makes me feel that you're separating the same stuff. Because from my experience, the greatest product teams are ones that are dealing with the actual customers, because otherwise they become insulated and they create something ultimately that customers don't want. However, the challenge that you highlighted when you do that, and I ran 5 engineering teams in the startup I was working, and so we kept it together, but the challenge was money talks and the priorities of the roadmap, which of course we'd got VCs to support, and everybody we're always down priorities to BMW or or Volvo or whatever customer that we were working with at that time, saying this is what I need now, and we need to implement this, and oh my gosh, there's this issue that we've found, etc. So you separated them. Can you talk a little bit, maybe Steve, you can talk about the balance of how you kept the product teams in the real world, and then also kept these other teams, these program teams, from not creating completely custom, adding new things that weren't ever going to be part of a product roadmap. How did you balance those?
Yeah, well, so good question, Dave. And just to set the table a little bit, and to follow on with what Yuval was saying just a moment ago, this operation is kind of like a systems integrator, right? So think of a systems integrator where you have a core set of products, and the reality is in the field, you're putting them together, you're configuring them to solve custom problems that particular jurisdiction has. And at a point in time, the organization kind of became all one group, right? So we had multiple programs going on that required multiple different features. And so you had feature teams embedded with the teams that were actually doing the program delivery. And it got to the point where each customer basically had their own branch of the code, right?
Oh,
And so
okay.
we really tried to split that for that reason. We wanted to have standard product offerings that could be configured. And those two functions are different, right? The product development team is working on the core product, core sets of features, and the delivery team is out there working with the customer, configuring it. There may be custom requirements that require something to go back to the product team, right? But we wanted to separate that, and we wanted to have a core product was standardized, had been hardened, fully qualified, no defects, that the delivery teams were then taking and running with, versus kind of doing it all together on the fly.
And Yuval, how did you navigate this when you sort of went in? What was your first observations?
I mean, it's an ongoing struggle. For me, it brings up conversations around team topologies, for example. So when you look at team topologies, there's the pattern that you want to see of being stream aligned, being the product team that really delivers the value end to end. They're empowered to run, but there's also the cognitive load if you're asking the team to do too much, and there's a place for having a platform, right? The question is, how do you slice? Think about our world, Dave. You could see a situation where professional Scrum trainers just go out there and build trainings on the fly, and every time we need something, we just create our stuff, which of course adds value because we're making it specific and real world context. But there's also value in the consistency, in having a platform that's shared, in bringing together the insights. But that creates the struggle of, how do you do that? How do you bring all of the knowledge, the insights from us PSTs connecting to the customers to a courseware team that's building the platform that we all use? That's your headache, Dave. It's kind of similar, I think.
It is a headache. Thank you for sharing that with our audience. And obviously we have tried many different things, including a sort of like an internal open source model with primary committers. We've tried all sorts of things. But you're right. And obviously we have the validation element on top, which means if they get out of sync too much, it goes horribly wrong, as I'm sure, Steve, you have, because you've got governance, you've got compliance, you've got rules, and those rules aren't consistent across these different agencies. It's the government, so they're appropriately confusing to ensure maximum slowness, which is probably a good thing. You're always managing that balance. Is that the sort of learning from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key takeaways here is that, we separate, just going back to that product versus program. It's kind of easy on the product side, right? You have a roadmap, you can kind of lay things out, and in structure is almost inherently there once you have a roadmap. On the delivery side, it's just chaos, right? Because the customers start and stop. You could have a customer that's been on pause for 3 or 4 or 6 months waiting for something to happen on their side. And then all of a sudden they come back and boom, they want you to pick up where you left off. And So we have, and I don't want to say that we have it nailed here. There's still some difficulties we have in managing customer expectations when those type of things happen. And I think we still struggle with, how do we say no, right? How do we say no? We've got 4 things going on in a team right now. I can't add a 5th, right? And I think that the teams are very, very much, their heads are in the right place in terms of wanting to do the right thing. And so sometimes we have to pull them back a little bit and say, no, four is enough for this team. In fact, it may be 1 too many. So how do we negotiate? How do we get back and properly set customer expectations so that we can operate and preserve some of the values that we're trying to really push on around flow and, work in progress and things of that nature?
So how did the leaders deal with this? Because when you've got the organization that you changed from was the ultimate flexible organization in their perception, because all the resources, the people, could be applied to a particular customer if they came online again, and you could stop all the other stuff. And then, whereas now you've got more, separate responsibilities and concerns. So how did the leadership take that, the change?
The leadership, meaning my leadership, or
Yeah,
the
your
leadership?
leadership, the people that are making the commitments, the people that are like, if we keep California happy, we'll get Utah, or whatever. I have no idea what the dynamics of the market are, but you know what I mean?
Well, one of the things I love about Lean Agile in this whole, process and, set of mechanisms is transparency. And I think that transparency, it kind of goes both ways, right? And I think a lot of times teams look at transparency as, oh, they're trying to get up in my shorts and trying to control what I do. And I've got a software background. I developed code for the first half of my career, and I think that in instances, leadership didn't really know what was going on in the trenches and therefore couldn't make the best decision. So I think the transparency in this case that we've been able to provide using this mechanism has enabled leadership to understand more of the problems and the dynamics that are going on at the team level, right? And if we can highlight those, then leadership can jump in and help us to manage the customer and maybe help with prioritization and so on. So I think that's kind of the key thing from my perspective, this transparency. It goes both ways.
Well,
I fully agree. I think the other interesting pattern that was interesting to work on, and I think helped here as well, was the concept of product ownership. We talked about the program, but even in these programs, we leveraged product ownership to help with some of what the teams were facing. Maybe Steve, you can talk to who were we thinking would be the product owners, and
so hang on.
What they're,
just to be clear, so product owners at both the program and at the product level as well. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. We have
Sounds interesting.
Two different sets really at the delivery level, right? Working with the customers and the programs. The product owners are the technical team leads, right? They have the domain experience. They've been doing this 15, 20 years. They understand the customers, the dynamics, and so on and so forth. And they're in a really good position to be able to accept stories and kind of lead the path, right? Help with at a high level with the sprint themes and so on. On the product side, it's more a partnership with product management. I wouldn't say that product management today is fully singly the product owner, but it's a shared responsibility between product management and the team leads of the individual product development teams.
It is an accountability. Obviously, the most effective implementation at accountability is a single human being, but as you transition to that or look at that, I think that's really interesting. And it's really interesting that you highlight at the delivery side or at the program side, you have that accountability clearly defined, because making those trade-offs for the customer, you can get into these cycles of despair. You're like, well, we do this, oh my God, what about that? And what about, somebody has to make a decision and break the cycle. And having somebody that gets both the technology and the business, which is ultimately what the product owner is, in that situation is incredibly powerful.
Exactly. Yeah. And these systems are fairly complex, and there are a lot of, unique workflows. When you get down to a state system or a county systems, there's legislative requirements in many instances that dictate that they need to operate in a certain way because the state legislature has made a law and you're mandated to do it this way. Whereas another state or another jurisdiction can have a different way of doing the exact same thing. So there's a lot of nuances here in these leads. It's really hard for somebody to come from the outside and be a team leader. It's not like your typical software factory, where you can bring a guy in or a girl in who's got 15 years Java experience, really good cloud native, this and that, and can hit the ground running. There's a lot of nuance around the domain here. And it takes a long time for people to get to that level. So once we get them, we really want to, unleash them and really empower them to make these decisions on the fly.
Product ownership is the hardest job in the world, in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. Yuval.
Yeah, I think one other element that makes it even harder in this context is it's not just the technical challenges, but it's also that they need to juggle multiple business needs, multiple project managers, delivery program managers on the business side that are asking for things for different jurisdictions, for different programs. Each one of these delivery teams works with multiple programs. At times, multiple ones of them, have demands, needs that have some time-bound aspect to it. So managing opportunity costs of delay, making some tough choices on what to focus on, what we can afford punting on. That's a really what I saw was they have their work cut out for them. That's like a really tough job, and it requires a lot of partnership and ability to influence and educate, the business people on the impact of things. The sort of stances that we want to see in effective product owners.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, transparency, managing stakeholders, managing value as well. I mean, all your customers are awesome, Steve, I'm sure, but there's certain situations that merit more focus than other situations. And that is a very political, complex. The loudest salesperson is not necessarily the most important or is right in a situation. So it's complex. So it's been going a while. You're seeing improvements. Is everybody kind of seeing this value being delivered, Steve?
Yeah, it's, I would say that we're probably mid-flight with this transformation. I think we're practicing Scrum pretty well right now. I think everybody's gotten into the routine. I'm seeing some cultural changes starting to emerge, and primarily around just how the teams are communicating, both, when they're doing sprint planning or as a team, or, communicating with other teams. And when we first started it, I would characterize the communications as really being driven by one or two people within a team, and it was, you jump into a sprint planning meeting and boy, it's really quiet and there's only one or two people doing the talking. And more recently, I've jumped into them and it seems like everybody is really engaged, right? And so for me, that was huge to see, right? I think that there's no trust issues on the team. The team is really open, encouraging people. People are jumping in and doing things without necessarily being assigned a task. They're seeing something that needs to be done and they're moving forward with it. So I think we're at that point there. Now, having said that, I think we need to make a little bit of a step function. Seems like we've plateaued a little bit. And some of the things we're starting to look at and how to measure and how to really just get us to the next level are around, flow and looking at where work is queuing and, theory of constraints, the whole Phoenix project, set of problems, right? Automation, really trying to drive and mature our automation, our pipelines, our testing, and so on. So I'm very encouraged that we'll be able to make that next step because the team seem to have embraced all of the processes and the culture is now starting to change a bit.
Yeah. From my experience, you definitely need that baseline of agility, dare I call it that, and then flow metrics and the things that you're talking about become useful. If you start with those, it, you haven't got an organization that can adapt to the information that's being presented to it. So I think that's really interesting.
We totally changed the metrics that we're tracking. And we started out, we had dashboards that had, the burn downs and the velocities and all of that stuff. And, frankly, we reached a point where, okay, we can see that the teams are now practicing Scrum. They're collecting these metrics. Great. But work was still queuing up. There were still silos in the organization. There was still all of these issues, and those are the problems we were really trying to solve from the get-go.
Yeah.
So we ditched a lot of those classic metrics, and we get together now once a month with each of the teams, and we go over just, flow and what was the last retrospective like? What were the problems that you identified? And, do you need any help overcoming them? And we actually had a very good conversation with a few of the teams this past week around, build environments. The builds are too slow. It takes us an hour and a half, but between the time we press the button to compile and we have something that we can test. Like, okay, well,
Wow.
that's a problem that sounds relatively straightforward and something that we can solve for you that would really save a lot of time and improve productivity and efficiency. So those are the types of discussions now that we're starting to engage in.
Wow. So it just took me back to my misspent youth of products like BuildForge and the like, where I spent a lot of time worrying about C++ compiler systems and how and build velocity, as it were, build speed. So thank you for that, Steve. I haven't felt that young in years. So Yuval, what about you? What's your perspective of how it's gone and the success that NEC has gleaned from this program?
The one thing I'll add here to what Steve described is, you know me, I really like the move away from some of the classic, metrics people associate with Scrum.
Yep.
To, what let's call it evidence-based metrics that we're talking about. I think flow is a great start, and it's fascinating the conversations I've had with Steve and some of his leadership team around how does theory of constraints play in here. There's the whole thinking around applying it there. That's been fascinating, and there's a lot to do in bringing TOC together with Scrum. I'm thinking that Steve and I need to have more conversations about evidence-based management, because I think there's some good stuff that we could take beyond flow metrics to talk through what's currently, an impediment to these teams' ability to innovate, to their time to market. And would it be interesting to look at the current value of the things that they're delivering and what are some gaps? So that's definitely a conversation we'll have offline.
It is a pattern that I see a lot, whereas you build the capability, the muscle memory, the capability of actually delivering value, and then suddenly it's like, what are we actually delivering? How are we prioritizing? Where does most of this stuff is just keep the lights on. Where's our innovation really happening? What is time to market really as measured? Is it the ability for a product to have it, or is it the ability for one of your program teams or delivery teams to pick it up and use it? Is it how fast are customers using these features? All of that stuff becomes really relevant, but it only becomes possible because of the great work you've already done, Steve.
Listen, we've come a long way, and you've always been a great coach for me and for the whole team. And really looking forward to this next phase. We haven't talked too much about SAFe, but we just started trying to implement PI planning. Back in January, we had our first one. We had our second PI a couple of weeks ago, and trying to do the same thing. Let's try and get it going, fail a little bit, and then bring somebody like Yuval in to set us straight and maybe hear some of the problems and the pain points that we're going through. So in addition to flow, Yuval, I would throw that on your backlog.
Yeah, I think, as long as you've got great teams with clear alignment to outcomes, then things like PI planning and SAFe can be a really good tool. Otherwise, it just accentuates the bad practices you have already in your organization
Yes.
in a very efficient way, which is always a bit of a worry. All right, so the last question, I have to ask this, and I'm sorry, we could talk for days about this. I think the journey that you went on, Steve, is a really interesting one, and something that I think many of our listeners can learn from. But we have to call an end to it. But I do have one last question. So I'm sitting, or maybe standing, or maybe walking, and listen to this podcast. A lot of people. I know Yuval always listens to podcasts while moving. They're listening to it and they're thinking they're in a similar position. They've got customers that have got needs, they've got a mess up of teams and services and capabilities, and they want to get better. What would be the one or two things that you would say, hey, this is what you should focus on, this is where you should start? I'd love to hear your perspective, Steve.
Well, it's a good question, Dave. I mean, I don't know. Let's see. I think just very generically speaking, I would say don't try to bite off too much. I think my advice would be start small, find a problem that you have in the organization, and then go backwards and figure out whether it's safe or just the basic Agile, the basic Scrum handbook. See what the solution is that's prescribed. Start small, try it. If it doesn't work, then try something different. But don't just try to go cold turkey and stop what you're doing and try something completely new.
Right, Yuval?
Yeah, I think it might be interesting to reflect back on how we started this journey and how we kind of chose to use professional Scrum and use the Scrum guide and professional Scrum with Kanban at NEC. Steve used SAFe. We used SAFe at a previous engagement because we had this scale where it made sense and there were some valuable aspects of SAFe that we used there. But we made a conscious decision when we were thinking about it here at NEC that, like Steve is saying, it might be too much, especially upfront for teams that have no idea how to use agility. So I said, okay, what is important? What's the baseline foundation that they need to understand? And it was pretty obvious to me, and I brought Steve and the team on board that's professional Scrum, and combined with the flow perspective that professional Scrum with Kanban provides. And we managed to create teams that can really own something. That's we talked about the program and product. We created a situation where we don't need to scale. We actually descaled a lot of the issues. So most of the concerns happen within teams. And, there's some level of collaboration that is needed. We do want, the right level of collaboration between the product people and the program people and maybe across different programs. And now, Steve and the team, now that they have a solid base of professional Scrum and flow and understand why they're doing this, now's the right time to start to pick some stuff from, other patterns, scaling patterns. Now they can safely go and take a look at the Scaled Agile Framework site and, take some stuff from there that works in their context, that maybe works in their context.
That's awesome. That's great advice. Gentlemen, thank you for taking the time out today to share your story with our listeners, to share it with me. I certainly learnt a lot, and I really do appreciate you taking the time.
Great. No, thank you, Dave, and good talking to you again, Yuval.
Thank you, Steve. Pleasure as always, Dave.
Okay, you heard it today. You heard an interesting story about advanced recognition systems of NEC and their journey to agility, and how they incrementally took it building that professional Scrum capability, adding flow, and now are looking at scaling and the next step. The separation of program or delivery teams from product teams and the challenges of product ownership and how valid and useful that those accountabilities are, even at that delivery team level. I've certainly learned a lot today. Hopefully you did, and thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, share with your friends, and of course, come back and listen to some more. I'm probably the luckiest person in the world because I get the opportunity to talk to these variety of guests we heard today from NEC and the journeys that they've been on. I always learn something, that pragmatic but valuable use of professional Scrum and how it connects with things like flow metrics, EBM, and even SAFe. So thank you for listening. And hopefully we'll get to talk again or listen again. Bye-bye and Scrum on.